And today I'm not all by myself. I brought in Jon Riggle, our lead diagnostician at Tri-City Transmission and Auto Repair. Jon, good to have you with us.
Morning, Dave.
And he is going to help me help you with your car. And today, this is just based off situations that we have in the week. And the one misunderstanding that I see come up over and over and over again is, man, how do we diagnose cars? And I think this expectation maybe comes a little bit out of a little bit of bad information. So everyone's heard the ad for Acme Auto Parts, which is down on the corner of the main street there. And you can take your car there, and as a courtesy, they'll come out and they'll plug into your car, and they'll give you a printout, a piece of paper, and they'll tell you what's wrong with your car. Jon, is that what's wrong with your car? What's going on there? What are they doing for you?
That's a list of possibilities. Unfortunately, every time they do that, there's kind of a misconception. There's this misconception. All you do is plug the machine in, and it tells you what's wrong with the car. Well, what they're giving you with that list is a possibility of things, and it's usually a list of parts that you might want to buy and try. So, it's kind of counterproductive in some ways.
So it can be kind of counterproductive. Now, what they're looking for when they plug into this car, see, when the modern vehicle has some sort of issue, it's run by a computer and monitored by a computer. And there's actually several computers within the car that monitor the car. And when it recognizes an error, it sets a message in the computer. We refer to it as a diagnostic trouble code, or you've heard, go scan it for codes.
Yep.
That's what everybody's referring to. And so there's going to be codes stored in the computer. And anytime you see that check engine light come on in your car, that's evidence that the computer has recognized an issue and that there is a code stored in the system. Now, every time a car has a problem, Jon, is there a code stored?
No, and not every time the check engine light comes on do you see a code stored afterwards. If you've got a bad computer, quite often you'll get the check engine light come on while the fault is present, but if the computer itself is bad, when we go to scan it, there won't be any codes there.
There won't be any codes in the system. So I go to Acme Auto Parts, they plug into it, and they say, hey, here's the codes that you have, and then it could be, it always says something like this, and I'll give you the most common one, an O2 sensor code, oxygen sensor. And most of the modern cars have 4 oxygen sensors. So they say, well, it could be the oxygen sensor, it could be the wiring, that's the way they all read, or it could be the computer. But more than likely it's probably the oxygen sensor. But what I've seen is 8 times out of 10 an O2 sensor or oxygen sensor code does not end up being an oxygen sensor replacement. So it's pretty low likelihood, just based off a code, what would I call a code diagnosis. The reason I thought of this, Jon, is we got a Nissan Murano in our shop, and it actually showed up last Friday, and I was out of town, and so the guy was complaining about vibration in the car. He was complaining about lack of power, and he thought that he had a transmission problem. And this was not his first trip to the auto shop for these issues. I believe it was his 3rd trip to the auto shop. He had tried a couple other things like spark plugs and that type of thing. And so I wasn't there on Friday, but I was back on Monday, and Jon said, hey, go drive this Murano with me. Tell me what you think. And so we took it for a spin and drove it, and kind of, it just wasn't very crisp. It was like drinking a can of soda that had been sitting out on the counter for 2 weeks, open.
Yeah.
It was missing something, but it still sort of tasted like Coca-Cola. It was just flat.
Yeah.
And so there was absolutely no codes stored. These codes that we're talking about, there was no code stored for the transmission, no code stored for the engine. So I called the guy up and I said, hey, I need a whole lot more information. And so I interviewed him literally for probably 15 minutes. And that's after Jon had interviewed him on Friday for some sort of time to get more information from him about his car. And I said, all right, I'm going to figure this out for you, but we're going to take a lot of time and energy to figure it out. So I'm going to need some diagnostic money beyond the $78 that we originally quoted him. It was going to be $300, or up to $300 to figure this thing out. He said, sure, no problem. He goes, I would love to get this car fixed.
Yeah.
He's already made attempts and tries and had all kinds of conversations. So what are some of the steps that we took, Jon, to figure out what was going on with that car?
We drove it a lot.
I think 4 of us drove it at different times and sometimes together.
Yeah, and that's kind of a trick is getting a sense of what's really going on when you've got a complaint that's kind of subjective like that. What is a lack of power? Okay, it just doesn't have enough power. So that's pretty subjective. So
Very.
Drove it quite a bit, and then I did some inspections with a scan tool, I watch the airflow through the motor. I watch the maximum amount of airflow. Airflow is directly proportional to horsepower. So I've got some guidelines I can use there. And when I saw that it was down on airflow, I knew that there was probably an engine performance problem more so than a transmission problem. So that gave me a direction to go. I kind of started to rule out transmission problem when I saw that.
So we literally went and borrowed a Nissan Murano from the neighboring shop.
Yeah.
Some of you have been listening a long time. I remember Joel from Arizona Imports. He calls me up because I got a Murano just like the one you're looking at. I said, great, can I come borrow it? So we went and borrowed it just to drive it, just to feel different.
Yeah.
Now you looking at airflow, so you were thinking maybe we got some restricted exhaust here.
That was my gut instinct, was a restricted exhaust. It's a fairly common failure on those.
So
Didn't happen.
he ended up putting pressure gauges in the O2 sensor ports in order to test, the back pressure or pressure building up in the exhaust, and everything there looked okay. And I'll tell you what, at the end of the day, what it ended up being was a bad actuator, which was on the intake runner control, which is basically a butterfly that opens up and changes the flow of air inside the engine intake. And the reason I thought this was a great topic is at the end of the day, the guys at the counter, and there was a whole lot of other conversations we had because we addressed some motor mounts for him and some other things. And he said, why was there no codes for that?
Yeah, that system simply isn't monitored on that car. It's computer controlled, but there's no monitoring for that system.
So you could have plugged in that thing all day long, and it was just based off of just inspection and driving and saying what else could it possibly be in order to arrive at that answer. And he was concerned about the vibration in the car. Well, when I first got in the car, the first time I started it up, I said, this car's got bad mounts.
Yeah.
So we knew it had a mount problem. That was the problem for his vibration. We knew it didn't have a transmission problem. We felt pretty strongly about that just based off the condition of the oil. That transmission, a CVT, they're pretty sensitive to set those codes when there is a slipping issue, and we didn't see any codes.
Yeah.
So in a lot of times when it comes to that, the computer is more sensitive than we are sometimes at finding slips in a transmission. So we didn't see that, so we were pretty confident the transmission was okay. But we had just kind of a little nest of little problems that was going on. And the point I wanted to make here is that I've seen it. I go to other auto shops where no one knows I'm in the auto business, and I sit there and I watch the guy at the service counter trying to explain to the customer that there's diagnostic charges. And they go, well, don't you just plug into it and it tells you what's wrong?
Yeah.
That's not the way it works. I mean, you do plug into it, and it's a piece of information, but it's sometimes a long ways away from what... And we literally probably had 5 hours in that car, John, figuring that thing out.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Between all the steps we took, between all the other mechanics that we got involved in it, and it was just an oddball, oddball type of situation. And one of the other things that came up this week is we did do a transmission for a guy on a Chevy truck. And we would drive it, and it would drive great. The next technician, we go through 3 technicians before we deliver a car. The next technician would jump into that car, and he would drive it, and he would say, the transmission works crappy, but the longer I drove it, it starts working good again. And the next technician would be the same thing. Yeah. And this all came down to the fact that the guy had a weak battery in his car. This battery was 6 years old. It still started the car.
Unbelievable, yeah.
But every time the voltage would drop down, we're talking about having code stored in the computer. If you got a weak battery, what happens? That voltage drops down enough to where that memory disappears. So that brings me to, and I called the guy up. I said, hey, you need a new battery. He said, yeah, I'll buy one on the way home. I said, no, you're buying one here before you get your car back because I can't confirm I fixed it until you got a good battery in the car. So we got a nice rack, freshly stocked with interstate batteries. And I said, hey, look, you may save $5 down the street, $10 down the street, getting a battery and doing it yourself and all that stuff. It's just better to get an interstate battery from me. It's got a good, 2-year free replacement warranty. And as long as you keep coming back to us, we'll always make sure it's good for you.